The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as Tom Parker Bowles stood by the window, his hands trembling slightly as he held the letter he had spent weeks drafting. His mother, Camilla, now queen consort, sat across from him in the ornate drawing room, her expression unreadable as she listened to his carefully rehearsed words. "Mother, I've given this considerable thought," Tom began, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "The monarchy has evolved, and perhaps it's time for certain traditions to evolve as well. Laura and I have been part of this family for decades now, yet we remain on the periphery, watching from the shadows while others enjoy privileges we can only dream of." Camilla set down her teacup with practiced grace, the delicate china making the slightest sound against the saucer. She had known this conversation was coming. The signs had been there for months. The pointed comments at family gatherings, the way Tom's jaw tightened when William's children were mentioned in the press, the increasing frequency of his visits to discuss family matters. "Tom, darling, you know how complicated these matters are," she said softly, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of royal protocol. "The line of succession, the titles, the roles, they're not mine to give or take away." But Tom was not deterred. He had spent too many years watching from the sidelines, too many occasions being introduced as merely the queen consort's son, while William's children were fawned over as future kings and queens. The injustice of it all had been eating away at him, and recent events had only intensified his determination. "I'm not asking for the moon, Mother," he continued, moving away from the window to face her directly. "But surely there's room in this institution for recognition of our contributions. Laura and I have supported you through everything, the difficult years, the public scrutiny, the gradual acceptance. We've been nothing but loyal, discreet, and supportive. Doesn't that count for something?" The conversation that morning would later be remembered as the spark that ignited a fierce debate within the palace walls. What Tom was proposing wasn't entirely unprecedented, but it was bold, perhaps too bold for an institution that had survived for centuries by adhering to strict protocols and hierarchies. As word of Tom's request began to circulate through the palace corridors, reactions were mixed. Some of the younger staff members, those who had joined the royal household in recent years, whispered among themselves about the fairness of his points. After all, they reasoned, the monarchy had shown itself capable of change. The very fact that Camilla had risen from controversial figure to queen consort was proof of that evolution. But the old guard, those who had served the royal family for decades, shook their heads knowingly. They understood what Tom perhaps did not, that every change in the royal structure was like moving a piece on a carefully balanced chessboard. One wrong move could topple the entire game. William was in his study at Kensington Palace when his private secretary knocked on the door with news of Tom's proposals. The Prince of Wales had been reviewing Cherry documents, his morning routine of catching up on correspondence before his official engagements began. As his secretary outlined the situation, William's expression grew increasingly stern. "He's asked for what exactly?" William inquired, his tone measured but with an underlying edge that those close to him recognized as controlled anger. The list was comprehensive. Tom had requested official royal titles for himself and his sister Laura, inclusion in certain state occasions previously reserved for blood royals, a formal role within the monarchy's structure, and, most audaciously, a revision of the financial arrangements that governed the extended royal family. William set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. He thought of his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how she would have handled such a request. The late queen had been masterful at maintaining the delicate balance between tradition and necessary change, but she had also been firm about protecting the institution's core principles. "Schedule a family meeting," William instructed his secretary. "But first, I need to speak with my father." King Charles III was in the middle of his weekly audience with the Prime Minister when his private secretary discreetly passed him a note about the developing situation. The king's expression remained diplomatically neutral as he continued his discussion about matters of state, but Those who knew him well would have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. Charles had always been caught between his love for Camilla and his duty to the crown. He had fought for years to have her accepted, first as his companion, then as his wife, and finally as his queen. The journey had been long and sometimes painful, with public opinion slowly shifting from hostility to acceptance. Now, it seemed, the delicate peace they had achieved was being threatened from an unexpected quarter. Later that evening, as the king sat in his private study, he found himself torn. On one hand, he understood Tom's position. The young man, though hardly young anymore at 50, had indeed been a model of discretion and support. He had never sold stories to the press, never capitalized on his connection to the royal family, and had built his own successful career as a food writer and critic. But Charles also understood what Tom apparently did not, that the monarchy's strength lay partly in its clear hierarchies and defined roles. Once those boundaries began to blur, where would it end? Today, it was Tom and Laura requesting recognition. Tomorrow, it might be other extended family members or even more distant relations claiming their right to royal privileges. The palace staff, meanwhile, found themselves in the unusual position of witnessing a family drama that had the potential to reshape the very institution they served. In the kitchens, over preparation of elaborate meals that might go uneaten given the tension in the air, opinions were divided. Some felt sympathy for Tom, remembering how dignified he had been during the years when his mother was vilified in the press. Others worried about the precedent his demands might set. Sarah, a long-serving lady-in-waiting, confided to a colleague over afternoon tea in the staff quarters, "I've seen many storms weather these walls, but this feels different. It's not coming from outside, it's brewing from within." Her companion, James, who had served as an equerry for 3 decades, nodded thoughtfully. The problem with family disputes in this place is that they're never just about family. They're about the institution, the country, the Commonwealth. Every decision reverberates far beyond these walls. As news of the situation began to leak, as palace news invariably did, the press started to circle like sharks scenting blood in the water. Royal correspondents who had built careers on their palace connections began making discreet inquiries, trying to piece together the full picture of what was being called the Parker Bowles problem. Tom, for his part, seemed unaware of the storm he was creating. Or perhaps he was fully aware and had decided that the time for quiet acquiescence had passed. His sister Laura, always the more reserved of the two, had initially been hesitant about his plans, but had ultimately agreed to support him. She too had felt the sting of being simultaneously inside and outside the royal circle, close enough to see the privileges, but not close enough to share in them. The situation was particularly delicate given the recent transition following Queen Elizabeth's passing. The monarchy was still finding its feet under Charles's reign, and public opinion, while generally favorable, remained fragile. Any hint of internal discord could potentially damage the careful work that had been done to modernize the institution while maintaining its essential character. William, as heir to the throne, felt the weight of this responsibility acutely. He had spent his entire life preparing for his future role, understanding that every decision he made would be scrutinized and would set precedents for generations to come. His response to Tom's demands would be seen as an indication of what kind of king he would one day be. In the days following Tom's initial approach to his mother, the atmosphere in the royal residences became increasingly tense. Meals were awkward affairs, with conversation carefully steered away from anything that might touch upon the elephant in the room. Even the usually irrepressible youngest generation of royals seemed to sense that something was amiss. Catherine, Princess of Wales, found herself in a particularly difficult position. As someone who had married into the royal family and understood the challenges of finding one's place within its rigid structure, she felt some sympathy for Tom's position. Yet she also understood, perhaps better than most, that the stability of the institution depended on maintaining certain boundaries. "It's not about fairness in the conventional sense," she explained to a close friend during a private conversation. "It's about protecting something bigger than any individual's desires or feelings. The monarchy belongs to the nation, not to us. Meanwhile, Tom's demands had become more specific, and, some thought, more unreasonable. He had submitted a formal document outlining his proposals, complete with historical precedents and legal arguments. The document suggested that as the Queen Consort's children, he and Laura occupied a unique position that warranted special consideration. He pointed to historical examples where royal titles have been extended to stepchildren or adopted children of monarchs, conveniently overlooking the fact that most of these cases had occurred centuries ago under very different circumstances. He also made economic arguments, suggesting that formally including him and Laura in royal duties could actually benefit the monarchy by expanding its reach and appeal to different demographics. The palace legal team was tasked with reviewing Tom's proposals, and their initial assessment was not encouraging. While there was no legal barrier to the king granting titles or roles to his stepchildren, the constitutional implications were complex. Any such move would require careful consideration of the Succession to the Crown Act, various Commonwealth agreements, and the delicate balance of public opinion. As days turned into weeks, the tension within the palace reached a boiling point. Servants reported heated conversations behind closed doors, though the exact words remained unknown. What was clear was that the royal family was divided, with some members sympathetic to Tom's position while others, led by William, remained firmly opposed. The Prince of Wales had made his position crystal clear in a family meeting that one insider described as Arctic. William had reportedly told Tom directly that his demands were inappropriate, ill-timed, and potentially damaging to the institution we all serve. The use of the word all was particularly pointed, suggesting that Tom, despite his lack of official position, had a duty to consider the monarchy's well-being above his personal desires. Tom's response to William's rebuke was not recorded, but those present reported that the tension in the room was palpable. Camilla, caught between her son and her stepson, had tried to mediate, but her efforts were largely unsuccessful. Charles, perhaps wisely, had said little during the meeting, observing the dynamics with the watchful eye of a king who understood that sometimes silence was the most powerful statement. The staff noticed changes in the daily routines of the palace. Where once there had been easy familiarity between family members, now there was formal politeness. Meals that had previously been family affairs became carefully orchestrated events with strategic seating arrangements designed to minimize potential conflict. Even the palace correspondence began to reflect the tension. Letters between the various royal residences, usually warm and familiar, became formal and businesslike. The Queen Consort's office, typically a hub of activity coordinating her numerous charitable endeavors, seemed subdued, with staff tiptoeing around their clearly distressed principal. Tom, perhaps realizing that his initial approach had not yielded the desired results, began to explore other avenues. He consulted with constitutional lawyers, historians, and even public relations experts, building a case that he hoped would be impossible to refute. His argument centered on the idea that the monarchy needed to evolve to remain relevant, and that recognizing the contributions of all family members, regardless of blood ties, was part of that evolution. But William remained unmoved. In a private letter to his father, parts of which were later leaked to the press, the Prince of Wales wrote, "The strength of our institution lies not in expanding its ranks, but in maintaining its essential character. We are custodians of something that belongs to the nation and the Commonwealth. Personal desires, however understandable, must always be secondary to that sacred duty." The letter, when it became public, divided opinion. Some praised William for his principled stance and his commitment to preserving the monarchy's traditions. Others criticized him as cold and inflexible, unable to recognize the changing nature of family in the 21st century. As the conflict deepened, both sides began to harden their positions. Tom, feeling rejected and unappreciated, became more insistent in his demands. He began to hint, through intermediaries, that he might be forced to take his case public if a satisfactory resolution couldn't be reached privately. This threat, whether real or imagined, sent shockwaves through the palace. The possibility of a public relations disaster loomed large. The monarchy had worked hard to rehabilitate its image following various scandals and controversies over the years. A public dispute between the queen consort's son and the heir to the throne would be a gift to Republicans and a nightmare for the palace communications team. Emergency meetings were convened, with senior courtiers trying to find a compromise that would satisfy Tom's need for recognition without undermining the fundamental structure of the monarchy. Various proposals were floated. Perhaps Tom and Laura could be given ceremonial roles without titles, or maybe they could be officially recognized as companions to the queen consort with certain privileges but no formal status. But Tom rejected these half measures. He had come too far, he felt, to accept what he saw as token gestures. His sister Laura, always more diplomatic, tried to persuade him to consider the offers, but Tom's mind was made up. It was all or nothing. The situation reached a crescendo when Tom made the unprecedented decision to request a private audience with the king, bypassing his mother entirely. This breach of protocol sent ripples through the palace hierarchy. Such direct approaches were simply not done, especially on matters of such sensitivity. Charles, after much deliberation, agreed to the meeting. What transpired between the king and his stepson remained private, but observers noted that Tom emerged from the hour-long audience looking subdued. Whatever Charles had said, it had clearly made an impact. In the following days, Tom's demeanor changed. The righteous anger that had fueled his campaign seemed to dissipate, replaced by a kind of resigned acceptance. Those close to him reported that he had been deeply affected by something the king had said, though he refused to share the details even with his mother. William, meanwhile, had been preparing his own response to the crisis. Working with his advisors, he crafted a statement that he hoped would definitively end the matter while minimizing damage to family relationships. The statement, when it was finally released internally, was a masterpiece of diplomatic language that nonetheless left no doubt about where the future king stood. The monarchy's strength, William's statement read in part, lies in its clarity of purpose and structure. While we value and appreciate all members of our extended family, we must maintain the distinctions that have served this institution and the nation for centuries. Personal affection cannot be allowed to override constitutional precedent. The palace staff, reading between the lines, understood that this was as close to a royal decree as one could get without actually being king. William had drawn a line in the sand, and it was clear that he would not be moved. The reaction to William's statement within the family was mixed. Some admired his clarity and decisiveness, seeing in it the qualities of a future king who would not be swayed by personal considerations. Others worried about the long-term damage to family relationships, wondering if the rift between William and Tom could ever be healed. Camilla found herself in an impossible position. As a mother, her instinct was to support her son and fight for his recognition. But as queen consort, she understood that her first duty was to support the king and the institution of monarchy. The conflict between these two roles was evident to all who saw her during this period, with even her closest friends noting the strain in her usually composed demeanor. As the weeks passed, the initial shock of the confrontation began to fade, replaced by a kind of uneasy truce. Tom, whether by choice or pressure, began to withdraw from his demands. He made no public statements, gave no interviews, and gradually returned to his normal life outside the royal spotlight. But those who knew him well could see that something had changed. The easy relationship he had once enjoyed with the royal family had been damaged, perhaps irreparably. The palace, meanwhile, began the delicate work of damage control. Subtle efforts were made to show the family united in public, with carefully orchestrated appearances designed to quell any rumors of discord. But behind the scenes, the relationships remained strained. William's cold response to Tom's demands had sent a clear message not just to Tom, but to anyone else who might harbor similar ambitions. The Prince of Wales had shown that he would be a different kind of king than his father, more rigid perhaps in some ways, but also more protective of the monarchy's essential character. As this first chapter of the saga drew to a close, the palace found itself forever changed by the events that had transpired. The shock of Tom's bold demands and William's cold response continued to reverberate through the corridors of power, a reminder that even in the most tradition-bound institutions, family dynamics could prove to be the most unpredictable and potentially destructive forces. The morning sun that had witnessed Tom's initial approach to his mother now set on a royal family that had been tested in ways they had not anticipated. And while the immediate crisis had passed, the underlying tensions remained, waiting perhaps for another day, another provocation, to surface once again. In the end, the palace had survived this particular shock, but at what cost? Only time would tell whether the relationships damaged in this confrontation could be repaired, or whether Tom Parker Bowles' bold demands and William's cold response had created a permanent fracture in the facade of royal unity. The autumn leaves fell like golden tears across the grounds of Highgrove House as King Charles stood at his study window, contemplating the fractured state of his family. 6 weeks had passed since the explosive confrontation between his stepson Tom and his heir William, and the reverberations continued to shake the very foundations of the monarchy he had inherited. The king's private secretary entered quietly, bearing a silver tray with the morning's correspondence. Among the usual state papers and diplomatic pouches lay a handwritten envelope that made Charles's heart sink. He recognized Tom's distinctive handwriting immediately. After weeks of silence, his stepson had chosen to communicate again, and Charles feared what new complications this letter might bring. "Your Majesty," the secretary ventured carefully, "the Queen Consort has requested a private word when your schedule permits." Charles nodded absently, his fingers hovering over Tom's letter. He knew Camilla had been suffering terribly through this ordeal, torn between maternal love and royal duty. Their conversations in recent weeks had been stilted, each afraid to voice their true feelings lest they wound the other further. As he opened Tom's letter, Charles was transported back to happier times when the blended family had seemed to work harmoniously. He remembered Tom and Laura at his wedding to Camilla, their genuine smiles and warm embraces. How had it come to this? The letter was lengthy, carefully worded, and surprisingly emotional. Tom wrote of his sleepless nights, his sense of rejection, and his growing realization that he had perhaps handled things badly. But intertwined with these conciliatory notes were hints of lingering resentment and a warning that made Charles's blood run cold. "I've tried to do things properly through the appropriate channels," Tom had written, "but I fear that my silence is being mistaken for acceptance. There are those in the media who have approached me, offering substantial sums for my story. Thus far, I have declined out of respect for you and Mother. But respect, I'm learning, must flow both ways." Charles set the letter down with trembling hands. The threat, though veiled, was clear. Tom was contemplating the nuclear option, going public with his grievances. Such a move would be catastrophic for the monarchy, particularly given the delicate balance Charles had worked so hard to achieve since ascending to the throne. Meanwhile, at Kensington Palace, William was dealing with his own correspondence. His staff had intercepted several attempts by journalists to reach out to various royal family members, fishing for information about the rumored Parker Bowles problem. The press, like sharks, had sensed blood in the water, even if they didn't yet know the full extent of the wound. Catherine entered William's study carrying their youngest child, who had been fussing all morning. The domestic scene stood in stark contrast to the weighty matters consuming William's thoughts. She settled into the chair across from his desk, studying her husband's tense expression with concern. "The children have been asking why Uncle Tom hasn't visited," she said gently. George, in particular, mentioned missing their cooking sessions. William's jaw tightened. This was precisely the kind of collateral damage he had feared. The adult conflicts were beginning to affect the younger generation, poisoning relationships that had once been warm and nurturing. "What am I supposed to tell them?" William asked, his voice carrying a rare note of uncertainty. "That Uncle Tom wants to fundamentally change the very nature of the institution they'll one day inherit? That he's threatening to destroy everything we've worked to build." Catherine shifted the baby to her other arm, choosing her words carefully. Perhaps we're looking at this too rigidly. Tom isn't asking to be in the line of succession. He's asking for recognition, for a place at the table he's been sitting near his entire adult life. William's eyes flashed with something close to anger. You sound like you're taking his side. I'm not taking anyone's side, Catherine replied evenly. I'm simply suggesting that there might be room for compromise. The monarchy has evolved before. It can evolve again without losing its essential character. Their conversation was interrupted by William's private secretary, who brought news that would shift the entire dynamic of the situation. A prominent Republican journalist had published a cryptic social media post hinting at explosive revelations about the royal family's treatment of certain members, to be revealed in an upcoming article. The palace communications team went into overdrive. Emergency meetings were called, strategies were debated, and contingency plans were activated. The possibility that Tom had already spoken to the media sent waves of panic through the usually composed palace machinery. Camilla, when informed of the development, felt physically ill. She retreated to her private chambers, dismissing her staff with uncharacteristic sharpness. Alone, she allowed herself to cry, tears of frustration, fear, and profound sadness for the family she had tried so hard to unite. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, who had served the royal family for over 30 years, later confided to a colleague, "I've never seen Her Majesty so distressed. She kept saying, 'I've failed them all. I've failed them all.'" The king convened an emergency meeting of his most trusted advisors. The keeper of the privy purse, the Lord Chamberlain, and the private secretary gathered in the blue drawing room at Buckingham Palace, their faces grave with the weight of the crisis. If Mr. Parker Bowles has indeed spoken to the media, the Lord Chamberlain began carefully, we need to consider our response options. Do we attempt to get ahead of the story? Do we prepare a counter-narrative? The private secretary, a man who had weathered many royal storms, shook his head. Any response legitimizes the story. Our best hope is that this journalist is fishing, that Tom hasn't actually broken ranks. But even as they strategized, Tom was sitting in his London flat, staring at his phone. 3 journalists had called that morning alone, each offering increasingly substantial sums for an exclusive interview. The numbers were staggering, enough to secure his children's futures, enough to make him independently wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. His sister Laura arrived unannounced, having driven up from her country home in a panic after seeing the social media posts. She found Tom in a state of agitation she had rarely witnessed in her usually composed brother. "Tell me you haven't done anything stupid," she said without preamble, throwing her coat over a chair. Tom's silence was answer enough. Laura sank into the sofa, her face pale with shock. "Not yet," Tom finally admitted, "but I've been thinking about it. They treat us like we're nothing, Laura, like we're an embarrassment to be managed rather than family to be embraced. And you think destroying everything will make it better?" Laura's voice was sharp with fear and anger. "You think our children will thank you for making them the center of a media feeding frenzy?" The siblings argued for hours, their voices rising and falling with the passion of their convictions. Laura reminded Tom of all the privileges they had enjoyed, the education, the opportunities, the protection that came with their connection to the royal family. Tom countered with examples of slights, exclusions, and the constant reminder that they would always be outsiders looking in. As their argument reached its crescendo, Tom's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end was calm, authoritative, and utterly chilling in its implications. It was Sir Edward Ashton, the Queen's former private secretary, now retired but still wielding considerable influence. His message was brief and to the point. "Mr. Parker Bowles, I believe we should meet. Tonight, discreetly. There are matters you need to understand before you make any irrevocable decisions." The meeting took place in a private room at one of London's most exclusive clubs. Sir Edward, despite his advanced age, commanded the space with the authority of someone who had spent decades at the heart of power. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Young man," he began, though Tom was hardly young at 50, "you are standing at the edge of a precipice. One step forward, and not only will you fall, but you'll take others with you, including your mother. Sir Edward proceeded to lay out, in devastating detail, exactly what would happen if Tom went public. He spoke of legal ramifications, financial consequences, and social exile. But more than that, he painted a picture of how Tom's actions would affect Camilla's position, potentially undermining her role as queen consort and destroying the acceptance she had worked decades to achieve. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years, Sir Edward concluded, not through sentiment or fairness as you understand it, but through discipline, duty, and sometimes harsh necessity. Your mother understands this. The question is, do you? Tom left the meeting shaken to his core. The implied threats had been subtle, but unmistakable. He drove aimlessly through London's nighttime streets, his mind churning with conflicting emotions and loyalties. At Clarence House, Camilla waited anxiously for news. She had been informed of Sir Edward's intervention. Not officially, of course, but through the Byzantine network of communications that characterized palace life. When her phone finally rang at nearly midnight, she answered it with trembling hands. "Mother." Tom's voice was exhausted, defeated. "I need to see you. Now." Their meeting in the small hours of the morning was emotional and raw. Tom broke down completely, the weeks of stress and conflict finally overwhelming his composure. Camilla held her son as he cried, her own tears falling silently. "I never wanted this," Tom sobbed. "I just wanted to belong, to truly belong." "I know, darling. I know," Camilla whispered, stroking his hair as she had when he was a child. "But some things aren't ours to have, no matter how much we might deserve them." As dawn broke over London, mother and son had reached a painful understanding. Tom would withdraw entirely from his demands and maintain public silence. In return, Camilla would work behind the scenes to ensure he and Laura received certain considerations. Nothing official, nothing that would set precedents, but small acknowledgments of their unique position. William, when informed of the resolution, remained skeptical. In a heated phone conversation with his father, he expressed doubts about Tom's commitment to silence. "He's shown his hand, father. He's demonstrated that he's willing to threaten the institution for personal gain. How can we trust him now?" Charles, exhausted by the weeks of tension, snapped back with uncharacteristic sharpness. "He's family, William. Complicated, difficult family, but family nonetheless. Your grandmother understood that sometimes we must manage situations with compassion rather than cold protocol." "My grandmother," William retorted, "would never have tolerated blackmail, emotional or otherwise." The conversation ended badly, adding another layer to the family's fractures. Charles found himself increasingly isolated, caught between his wife's anguish, his son's inflexibility, and his stepson's bitterness. The palace staff, meanwhile, struggled to maintain normalcy amid the palpable tensions. Royal engagements continued, charitable work proceeded, and the machinery of monarchy ground on. But there was a brittleness to it all, a sense that they were performing roles in an elaborate play, while the real drama unfolded behind closed doors. One senior courtier, speaking anonymously to a trusted friend, described the atmosphere as walking on eggshells covered in gunpowder. Every interaction between family members was scrutinized for signs of the underlying conflict. Every public appearance was analyzed for body language that might betray the private turmoil. The Republican journalist who had started the latest panic with his social media post published his article, but it was far less explosive than feared. Without Tom's cooperation, he had only rumors and speculation. The palace's relief was palpable, but the near miss served as a warning of how precarious their situation remained. In the weeks that followed, a new normal slowly emerged. Tom retreated from royal circles almost entirely, focusing on his work and avoiding family gatherings where possible. When attendance was unavoidable, interactions were polite but distant, the warm familiarity of the past replaced by careful formality. Laura, caught between loyalty to her brother and her desire to maintain family harmony, found her own way of coping. She became a quiet bridge between the camps, maintaining relationships with all parties while carefully avoiding any discussion of the recent conflicts. The younger generation of royals noticed the change, of course. Children are often more perceptive than adults give them credit for, and the absence of Uncle Tom from family gatherings did not go unremarked. Catherine and William struggled to explain the situation in age-appropriate terms, resorting to vague statements about adult disagreements and busy schedules. As Christmas approached, the traditional gathering at Sandringham loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. The press had begun to speculate about whether Tom and Laura would attend, their presence or absence seen as a barometer of family relations. Camilla, desperate to salvage some semblance of family unity, pleaded with Tom to attend. Just for Christmas Day, she begged. For the children, if nothing else. We can't let this poison everything. Tom's response was noncommittal. He understood the importance of appearances, but the wounds were still too fresh. The thought of sitting at the same table as William, making small talk while anger and resentment simmered beneath the surface, filled him with dread. William, for his part, made it clear through intermediaries that while he would fulfill his duty and be civil if Tom attended, there should be no expectation of warmth or reconciliation. His position remained unchanged. Tom had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The media, sensing the ongoing tension, intensified their coverage. Royal watchers analyzed every photo, every gesture, every word for signs of the rumored rift. The palace communications team worked overtime to present a united front, but cracks in the facade were becoming increasingly difficult to hide. One particularly persistent journalist managed to corner Laura at a charity event, asking directly about her brother's relationship with the royal family. Laura's response, a tight smile and a redirect to the charity's work, spoke volumes to those skilled in reading between the lines. As December progressed, the pressure mounted. Charles found himself medicating for stress-induced insomnia, while Camilla's staff worried about their normally robust employer's declining appetite and energy. The Queen Consort threw herself into her charitable work with almost manic intensity, as if staying busy could keep the pain at bay. Behind the scenes, senior courtiers debated whether the situation was sustainable. Some argued for a more formal resolution, perhaps a written agreement that would clearly delineate boundaries and expectations. Others feared that any formal acknowledgement of the conflict would only legitimize Tom's original complaints. Sir Edward Ashton, despite his retirement, remained a shadowy presence in the discussions. His intervention had prevented immediate disaster, but he warned that the underlying issues remained unresolved. "We've bought time," he told a select gathering of senior royals and advisors, but time for what? Without genuine resolution, we're simply postponing the inevitable. The question of inevitability haunted Charles as he prepared for his second Christmas as king. The institution he had inherited from his mother seemed more fragile than ever, threatened not by external forces, but by the complex dynamics of a modern blended family trying to fit into an ancient framework. As he reviewed the Sandringham guest list, making final decisions about arrangements, Charles found himself thinking about the nature of family itself. Was it defined by blood, by law, by affection, or by shared duty? And what happened when these different definitions came into conflict? The answers, he knew, would shape not just his reign, but the future of the monarchy itself. The shock waves from Tom's bold demands and William's cold response continued to ripple outward, touching every aspect of royal life. The institution had weathered many storms over the centuries, but this one felt different, more personal, more intractable, and potentially more damaging than any external threat. As the second phase of this family crisis drew to a close, the palace prepared for a Christmas that would test all their skills at maintaining appearances. The world would be watching, analyzing every moment for signs of discord or reconciliation. And somewhere in London, Tom Parker Bowles sat alone in his flat, wrestling with his own decision about whether to play his part in the royal Christmas pantomime or finally break free from the golden cage that had defined and confined him for so long. The autumn leaves had long since fallen, leaving the trees bare and exposed. Winter had arrived at the palace, both literally and metaphorically, and no one knew when or if spring would come again to thaw the frozen relationships within Britain's most famous family. The ancient bells of Westminster Abbey rang out across a frost-covered London as Christmas Eve descended upon the capital. Inside Buckingham Palace, preparations for the royal family's departure to Sandringham were underway, but the usual excitement that accompanied the festive season was notably absent. The staff moved through their duties with quiet efficiency, acutely aware of the tension that permeated every corner of the residence. King Charles stood in his private study, holding a crystal tumbler of whiskey that he had barely touched. Before him lay two documents that represented the crossroads at which the monarchy now found itself. The first was a formal letter from Tom Parker Bowles, delivered that morning, stating his intention to absent himself from all royal gatherings indefinitely. The second was a draft statement prepared by William's office, outlining new protocols for extended family members that would effectively formalize their exclusion from official royal functions. The king's private secretary knocked gently before entering. "Your Majesty, the Queen Consort wishes to know if you've made a decision about the Sandringham arrangements." Charles turned from the window, his face showing every one of his 70-plus years. "Tell her I'll be with her shortly, Martin, and ask the Prince of Wales to join us. It's time we settled this matter once and for all." What followed was a meeting that would be remembered as one of the most difficult in the modern monarchy's history. Camilla entered the blue drawing room with red-rimmed eyes, having spent much of the morning trying unsuccessfully to change Tom's mind. William arrived precisely on time, his expression carefully neutral, but his body language radiating determination. "We cannot go on like this," Charles began without preamble. "The family is fracturing, the press is circling, and we're approaching a point of no return. William, I've read your proposals. Camilla, I understand Tom's position. Now we must find a way forward that preserves both the institution and what remains of our family bonds." William spoke first, his tone respectful but firm. "Father, with all due respect to Camilla, Tom has shown that he views his connection to our family as transactional. He's made demands, issued threats, and demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what the monarchy represents. My proposals simply formalize what should have been clear from the beginning." Camilla's composure finally cracked. "Transactional? My son has given decades of his life to supporting this family. He's never sold a story, never traded on his connections, never asked for anything until now. And what he asked for wasn't unreasonable. It was recognition, belonging, a place at the table he's been sitting beside his entire adult life." The argument that erupted was unlike anything the palace had witnessed in recent memory. Voices were raised, accusations flew, and years of carefully suppressed resentments boiled to the surface. Charles tried to mediate, but found himself pulled into the conflict as both his wife and son demanded he take a side. "You want me to choose?" Charles finally exploded, his own composure shattering. "Between my wife and my son? Between the woman I love and the future of the crown? This is exactly the kind of choice that destroys families and weakens monarchies." The room fell silent at the king's outburst. In that moment of quiet, they could hear the distant sound of carolers on the mall, their joyful songs a stark contrast to the misery within the palace walls. It was Camilla who broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps Tom is right. Perhaps we've been fooling ourselves all along, thinking we could blend our families without truly blending our lives. The monarchy accepts me as queen consort, but it will never accept my children as anything more than awkward appendages." William's response was swift and cutting. "The monarchy accepted you, Camilla, because my grandmother and father wished it, and because you proved yourself worthy of the role. But that acceptance was never meant to extend infinitely to every connection, every relative, every person who might claim proximity to the throne. Where would it end?" With basic human decency, Camilla shot back, her grief transforming into anger. "With treating people who've shown nothing but loyalty and discretion is more than just potential problems to be managed. As the argument continued, none of them noticed the figure who had quietly entered the room. Princess and the king's sister had arrived at the palace for a scheduled meeting and, hearing the raised voices, had made her way to the blue drawing room. "Enough," and said, her commanding voice cutting through the discord like a blade. "You're all so busy protecting your positions that you've forgotten what we're supposed to be protecting." The three turned to her, momentarily united in their surprise at her arrival, and moved into the room with her characteristic no-nonsense bearing, fixing each of them with a stern gaze. "Charles, you're trying to please everyone and thereby pleasing no one. William, your inflexibility is admirable in principle, but destructive in practice. And Camilla, while I understand a mother's pain, your son made his choices when he attempted to leverage family connections for personal gain." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "But standing here listening to you tear each other apart, I'm reminded that we've faced worse crises and survived them, not through rigid adherence to protocol or emotional manipulation, but through finding that delicate balance between tradition and evolution that has kept this institution relevant for centuries." Anne's intervention proved to be the catalyst for a more productive discussion. Over the next several hours, the four royals worked through the issues with and serving as mediator. Slowly, painfully, a compromise began to emerge. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Tom and Laura would be granted the courtesy title of companions to the queen consort, a designation that acknowledged their unique position without setting precedents for future generations. They would be included in major family occasions, but not state functions, and a modest annual allowance will be provided from Camilla's personal funds rather than the public purse. In exchange, Tom would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and commit to maintaining a low profile regarding his royal connections. Any future attempts to leverage his position would result in immediate revocation of all privileges and potential legal action. William remained skeptical, but agreed to the compromise for the sake of family unity. "But let me be clear," he stated, looking directly at Camilla. "This is a one-time accommodation based on unique circumstances. It does not set a precedent, and any violation of the terms will be met with the full force of the institution's protection mechanisms." As the meeting concluded, Charles felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The crisis had been averted, but at what cost? The easy warmth that had once characterized family gatherings seemed irretrievably lost, replaced by carefully negotiated truces and formal arrangements. The news of the compromise reached Tom through his mother that evening. He received it with a complex mixture of emotions: relief that he hadn't been entirely cast out, disappointment that his grander ambitions had been thwarted, and a lingering bitterness that it had taken such extreme measures to achieve even this modest recognition. Laura, ever the pragmatist, was simply grateful the ordeal was over. "Can we now please just try to be a normal family?" she asked her brother during a late-night phone call. "Or as normal as any family connected to the crown can be?" Tom's bitter laugh was his only response. The palace communications team, meanwhile, prepared for the delicate task of managing the public narrative. A carefully worded statement was drafted, announcing the new courtesy titles as part of the king's modernization efforts and his desire to properly recognize all members of the modern royal family. No mention was made of the conflicts that had necessitated this solution. The press response was mixed. Some praised Charles for his inclusive approach, while others questioned why such titles were necessary now, when Tom and Laura had managed without them for decades. Royal correspondents, sensing there was more to the story, began their inevitable digging. As Christmas Day dawned at Sandringham, the royal family presented a united front for the traditional walk to church. Tom and Laura were present, their new status subtly acknowledged in the order of procession. The photographers captured smiling faces and apparently warm interactions, but those with keen eyes noticed the careful choreography of it all. Inside St. Mary Magdalene Church, as the familiar carols rang out, each member of the royal family sat with their own thoughts. Charles prayed for healing and wisdom, Camilla for her children's happiness, William for the strength to protect the institution he would one day lead, and Tom for the grace to accept what could not be changed. The Christmas lunch that followed was a masterpiece of diplomatic staging. Conversation flowed along safe channels. The weather, the children's excitement about their presents, plans for the new year that carefully avoided any contentious topics. The younger generation of royals, sensing the adult tensions, provided welcome distraction with their natural exuberance. It was during the Queen's traditional Christmas broadcast that the real impact of recent events became clear. Charles had insisted on recording his message after the family reconciliation, and his words carried a weight that resonated beyond the usual festive platitudes. This year has reminded me that families, even royal ones, face challenges, Charles said, looking directly into the camera. But it is through meeting these challenges with wisdom, compassion, and compromise that we grow stronger. The monarchy has always evolved with the times while maintaining its essential character, and we continue that evolution today. Tom watched the broadcast from the drawing room at Sandringham, surrounded by family, yet feeling oddly isolated. The king's words seemed directed at him, a public acknowledgement of their private struggles. He caught William's eye across the room and saw something that might have been a slight nod. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance. In the days following Christmas, the new normal began to establish itself. Tom and Laura's courtesy titles were formally announced, and the Palace Protocol Office issued discreet guidance on their proper usage and the privileges they entailed. The document was a masterwork of bureaucratic precision, defining boundaries with surgical accuracy. The press, predictably, had a field day with the announcement. Opinion pieces proliferated, with some celebrating the modernization of the monarchy and others decrying it as a dangerous precedent. Republican voices seized on the controversy as evidence of the institution's inherent unfairness and outdated nature. Tom, bound now by his agreement, remained silent in the face of media speculation. Journalists who had previously courted him found their calls unreturned, their emails unanswered. The substantial sums that had been offered for his story remained unclaimed, the checks unwritten. But the personal cost of the conflict continued to manifest in small ways. Where once Tom had been a regular presence at family gatherings, his appearances became increasingly rare. The formal invitations came, as agreed, but there was a stilted quality to the interactions that no amount of diplomatic nicety could overcome. William, true to his word, maintained a cordial but distant relationship with his step-uncle. Their conversations, when necessary, were brief and focused on practical matters. The easy camaraderie of earlier years was gone, replaced by the kind of polite formality reserved for distant acquaintances. Catherine tried to bridge the gap, particularly for the sake of the children, but found her efforts largely rebuffed. Tom, wounded by what he perceived as William's coldness, extended that distance to William's immediate family. The cooking sessions with George ceased, the informal visits ended, and another generation began to experience the cost of adult conflicts. Camilla threw herself into her work with renewed vigor, as if professional success could compensate for personal pain. Her charitable endeavors flourished. Her public appearances were flawlessly executed, but those closest to her noticed a sadness that hadn't been there before. The victory, such as it was, had come at too high a price. As winter gave way to spring, the palace settled into its new rhythms. State functions proceeded without the Parker Bowles siblings. Family gatherings included them according to the strictly defined protocols, and the machinery of monarchy continued its eternal rotations. But beneath the surface, the fault lines remained. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to rebuild. The compromise that had seemed like a solution in the heated atmosphere of Christmas Eve revealed itself to be merely a bandage over a deeper wound. Tom, in a moment of reflection shared with his sister, observed, "We got what we asked for in a way. Recognition, titles, a defined place in the structure. But somehow, in getting what we wanted, we lost what we had." Laura, ever practical, responded, "What we had was always an illusion, Tom. We were tolerated, not accepted. At least now we know where we stand. The conversation was overheard by a member of staff and, as palace conversations often were, found its way through the gossip networks that connected royal households. When it reached William's ears, his response was telling. They finally understand. But understanding and acceptance were two different things. The royal family had found a way to continue functioning, but the warmth and genuine affection that had once characterized their gatherings had been replaced by careful diplomacy and managed interactions. As spring turned to summer, the palace prepared for the first major state occasion since the Christmas Compromise. The question on everyone's mind was how the new arrangements would play out in the full glare of public scrutiny. Would Tom and Laura's absence from the formal proceedings be noticed? Would the press narrative focus on who was included or who was excluded? Charles, reviewing the arrangements with his staff, felt the weight of his decision keenly. He had chosen compromise over conflict, inclusion over exclusion, but the price had been higher than anticipated. The monarchy had evolved as it always did, but evolution was a slow and sometimes painful process. The preparations continued with typical royal precision, each detail carefully considered, each potential problem anticipated and planned for. But no amount of planning could address the fundamental fracture at the heart of the family, the recognition that blood, duty, and affection did not always align, and that choosing between them could leave scars that even time might not heal. As the third act of this royal drama drew to a close, the palace stood as it always had, a symbol of continuity and tradition in an ever-changing world. But within its walls, a family grappled with the very modern challenge of defining itself in an institution where definitions had been fixed for centuries. The shock of Tom's bold demands had faded, replaced by the dull ache of a new reality. William's cold response had proved effective in protecting the institution, but at the cost of family warmth. And somewhere between tradition and modernity, between inclusion and exclusion, the British royal family continued its eternal balancing act, forever changed by the crisis that had threatened to tear it apart. The morning mist clung to the Thames as London awakened to what would become known as one of the most significant days in modern royal history. 6 months had passed since the Christmas Compromise, and the carefully constructed peace was about to face its greatest test. Tom Parker Bowles sat in his solicitor's office, staring at a document that would either vindicate his position or destroy what remained of his relationship with the royal family forever. The document was a manuscript, his manuscript, written in secret over the previous months as a form of therapy, he had told himself. But therapy had evolved into something more dangerous, a detailed account of his life adjacent to the throne, complete with intimate family moments, private conversations, and his perspective on the conflicts that had nearly torn the family apart. The publishers are offering 7 figures, his solicitors said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. They're calling it the literary event of the decade. But, Tom, you must understand the consequences if you proceed. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. Every word was true, every incident accurately recalled, but truth and wisdom were not always companions. He thought of his mother's face when she learned of the manuscript's existence, of the legal agreements he had signed, of the bridges that would be not just burned, but obliterated if he gave the final approval. At Buckingham Palace, an emergency meeting was already underway. Intelligence had reached the palace about Tom's manuscript 3 days earlier, and the machinery of royal protection had sprung into action. William sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of controlled fury, while Charles looked as if he had aged a decade overnight. He gave his word, William said, his voice deadly quiet. He signed agreements. He accepted our terms. And now this. The palace legal team had reviewed their options, and they were limited. While they could certainly pursue legal action for breach of contract, the publicity would be devastating. The very act of trying to suppress the book would generate more interest than its publication might have achieved naturally. Camilla had not been invited to this meeting, a decision that had caused another fierce argument between Charles and William. The Prince of Wales had been adamant. She cannot be objective in this matter. Her maternal instincts will cloud her judgment. But Camilla had her own sources within the palace, and she knew exactly what was being discussed. Alone in her private study at Clarence House, she composed letter after letter to her son, each one torn up and discarded as inadequate. How could she convey the magnitude of what he was about to do? How could she make him understand that some actions could never be undone? Meanwhile, the press had begun to sense that something significant was afoot. Royal correspondents noticed the unusual flurry of activity at the palace, the grim faces of usually composed courtiers, the canceled engagements explained away with vague excuses. Social media buzzed with speculation, and within hours, #RoyalCrisis was trending globally. It was Princess and who proposed a solution that would either save or sink them all. If he's determined to tell his story, she said during a private conversation with Charles, then perhaps we should tell ours first. Complete transparency, on our terms, before he can set the narrative. The idea was radical, unprecedented, and potentially catastrophic. But as Charles considered it, he began to see the wisdom. The monarchy had survived through adaptation, and perhaps this was simply another evolution, a move towards the kind of openness that the modern world demanded. William was horrified by the suggestion. You want us to air our private business in public? To legitimize his betrayal by participating in it? I want us to survive, and replied bluntly. And sometimes survival means doing the unthinkable. As the royal family debated their response, Tom sat alone in his flat, his phone silent despite the dozens of calls and messages flooding in. He had given his solicitor 48 hours to negotiate the best possible deal, but now, in the quiet of his home, the reality of what he was contemplating hit him with full force. He walked to his window and looked out at the London skyline, the city that had been his home all his life. Somewhere out there, his mother was probably crying. His sister was likely furious. And his children, what would they think when they were old enough to understand what he had done? The manuscript lay on his coffee table, its pages containing not just his story, but the stories of people he claimed to love. He had written about William's private doubts about the monarchy, overheard during an unguarded moment. He had described Charles's struggles with the competing demands of duty and personal happiness. He had revealed Camilla's tears and fears during the early days of her relationship with Charles. Every revelation was justified in his mind by the greater truth he was trying to convey, that the monarchy was composed of flawed human beings struggling with impossible demands. But would the world see it that way, or would they simply see it as a betrayal of the most fundamental kind? At Kensington Palace, Catherine was attempting to shield her children from the growing crisis. But children have a way of sensing when something is wrong, and George, in particular, had been asking difficult questions. Why doesn't Uncle Tom visit anymore? He asked over breakfast. Do we do something wrong? Catherine exchanged a glance with William, who had barely slept in 3 days. The burden of protecting the institution was weighing heavily on the future king, and she could see the toll it was taking. Sometimes adults have disagreements, she said carefully. It doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong. It just means that people sometimes want different things. But even as she spoke the words, Catherine wondered if they were true. Had anyone really done anything wrong, or had they all simply been caught in an impossible situation where love, duty, and ambition collided? The crisis deepened when an excerpt from Tom's manuscript was leaked to a tabloid newspaper. The excerpt, clearly chosen for maximum impact, detailed a Christmas dinner where William had allegedly made disparaging remarks about Camilla's children playing at being royal. The palace immediately denied the accuracy of the account, but the damage was done. Public opinion split dramatically. Some saw Tom as a truth-teller, bravely exposing the hypocrisy and cruelty of an outdated institution. Others viewed him as a traitor, selling out his family for money and fame. Social media became a battlefield, with hashtags like #TeamTom and #TeamWilliam trending as people took side in a conflict they only partially understood. Charles, watching his life's work unravel, made a decision that shocked even his closest advisors. He would meet with Tom personally, without lawyers or advisors, and attempt to resolve the crisis man to man, stepfather to stepson. The meeting took place at Highgrove, Charles's beloved country estate. Tom arrived to find Charles alone in the garden, tending to his organic vegetables as if it were any other day. The normality of the scene was almost surreal given the circumstances. "I used to bring you here when you were young," Charles said without looking up from his plants. "You and Laura would help me with the gardening. You particularly loved the strawberries." Tom felt a lump in his throat at the memory. Those had been simpler times before titles and protocols, and the weight of expectation had poisoned everything. "I never wanted it to come to this," Tom said quietly. Charles finally looked up, and Tom was shocked to see tears in his stepfather's eyes. "Then why, Tom? Why now? We gave you what you asked for. We found a compromise." "Because the compromise was just another way of keeping us in our place," Tom replied, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Companions to the queen consort. It sounds grand, but what does it mean? We're still outsiders, still treated as problems to be managed rather than family to be embraced." The two men talked for hours, walking through the gardens as the sun tracked across the sky. Charles shared his own struggles with feeling like an outsider, waiting decades to fulfill his destiny while watching his mother reign. He spoke of the sacrifices required by duty, the personal happiness subordinated to public service. Tom countered with his own perspective, the constant reminders of his second-class status, the subtle slights that accumulated over years, the feeling of being used when convenient and discarded when problematic. "But don't you see," Charles said finally, "that by publishing this book, you're not hurting the institution, you're hurting us. Real people who have real feelings, whatever our titles might be." As their conversation continued, neither man noticed the figure watching from an upstairs window. Camilla had arrived at Highgrove unexpectedly, drawn by a mother's instinct that her son needed her. She watched the two most important men in her life walk together through the gardens, their body language tense, but not hostile, and allowed herself a moment of hope. That hope was bolstered when Tom returned to the house with Charles, both men looking emotionally drained but somehow lighter. The three of them sat together in Charles's study, and for the first time in months, they talked not as king, queen consort, and problematic stepson, but as a family grappling with impossible circumstances. "I won't pretend to understand your pain," Charles said to Tom, "but I'm asking you to consider not just what you might gain from publication, but what we all stand to lose." Tom was quiet for a long moment before responding. "And what if I don't publish? What changes? Do I go back to being the invisible stepson, trotted out for family photos, but excluded from anything meaningful?" It was Camilla who answered, her voice strong despite her tears. "No, we find a new way forward. A better way. Not perfect, perhaps, but better." The negotiation that followed was unlike any the palace had ever undertaken. Over the course of the next week, a new agreement was hammered out. Tom's manuscript would be placed in a sealed archive, not to be published for 50 years. In exchange, his role within the family would be genuinely reconsidered. William, when informed of the negotiations, was initially resistant. But Catherine, in a private moment that would prove pivotal, helped him see the bigger picture. "Your grandmother knew when to be firm and when to bend," she reminded him. "This is a moment for bending, William, for the sake of your father, for Camilla, for the children who don't understand why their family is fracturing." The final agreement was more generous than the Christmas compromise, but less than Tom's original demands. He and Laura would receive substantive roles in Camilla's charitable endeavors, with genuine responsibility and public recognition. They would be included in family events not as courtesy additions, but as full participants. And, most importantly, there would be a formal acknowledgement of their unique position within the modern royal family. The announcement of the resolution was carefully managed. The palace released a statement praising the family's ability to work through challenges with mutual respect and understanding. No mention was made of the manuscript or the near catastrophe it had represented. Tom's publishers were disappointed, but legally unable to proceed without his cooperation. The seven-figure advance disappeared, but Tom found, to his surprise, that he felt relief rather than regret. The money would have been life-changing, but some changes, he realized, weren't worth making. The healing process was slow and sometimes painful. The first family gathering after the resolution was awkward, with everyone hyper-aware of the fragility of their reconciliation. But gradually, tentatively, relationships began to rebuild. William and Tom's relationship would never return to its previous warmth, but they found a working détente based on mutual respect for what each had been willing to sacrifice. Tom had given up a fortune and a chance to tell his story on his terms. William had compromised on principles he held dear for the sake of family unity. The children, resilient as children always are, adapted quickly to Uncle Tom's renewed presence. The cooking lessons resumed, albeit with a formality that hadn't been there before. But it was a start, a foundation on which to build. Camilla, freed from the constant fear of family explosion, threw herself into her expanded charitable work with Tom and Laura as genuine partners. The press, initially skeptical, gradually came to accept the new arrangement as simply another evolution in the ever-changing royal landscape. As the first anniversary of the crisis approached, Charles reflected on what had been learned. The monarchy had faced an existential threat not from Republicans or scandals, but from within its own walls. They had survived, but the scars remained. "We came so close to losing everything," he confided to, and during a quiet moment at Balmoral. And pragmatic as always, replied, "But we didn't. And perhaps we're stronger for having faced it." The manuscript remained in its sealed archive, a reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Tom occasionally thought about what might have been the money, the fame, the vindication of having his story heard. But watching his mother smile genuinely for the first time in over a year, seeing his children play with their royal cousins, being included in family decisions not as an afterthought, but as a valued voice, he knew he had made the right choice. The monarchy had evolved once again, adapting to the realities of modern family life. It wasn't perfect, nothing involving human emotions and ancient institutions ever could be, but it was real, honest in its imperfection, and stronger for having been tested. As Tom stood with the family on the balcony of Buckingham Palace during the King's birthday celebrations, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine belonging. The crowds below saw a united royal family, and for once, the image matched the reality, however hard-won that reality had been. William caught Tom's eye during the celebration and offered something that hadn't been seen in over a year: a genuine smile. Not warm, perhaps, but real. And in that moment, Tom understood that sometimes the greatest victories came not from getting everything you wanted, but from knowing when to stop fighting for it. The palace, which had weathered so many storms over the centuries, had survived another. But this one had left its mark not in changed protocols or new traditions, but in the understanding that even the most ancient institutions must sometimes bend or risk breaking entirely. The shock of Tom's bold demands had given way to a new equilibrium, one that acknowledged the complexities of modern life while preserving the essential character of the monarchy. As the sun set on that celebration day, the royal family retreated into the palace, no longer divided by resentment and misunderstanding, but united by the recognition that they had faced the abyss and stepped back from the edge. The crisis that had begun with bold demands and cold responses had ended not with victory or defeat, but with something far more valuable: understanding, compromise, and the hope that the bonds of family, however tested, could ultimately endure.